Alright everyone, it's time for Occult Literature video number 120, Funeral Customs by Puckle. Very interesting work, full length, 238 pages. You'll notice that my edition costs about 30 cents more than the only other competing edition. However, the only other competing edition of this work is a facsimile copy, so there's really no comparison. Mine's actually in a modern format. Link, as always, in the description to my edition of this work on Amazon. Second link as well to my books blog. If you're interested in sort of the folklore and history side of the occult and the spiritual, I've got several dozen titles available. I will be making a new category fairly soon as I finish up one final work that will go into sort of the mythology and spiritualism section. Now, this particular work is probably most interesting to most people. Despite being a lesser-known work, surprisingly, I would have figured that a lot of people had read this because it's one of the only elaborate, lengthy works from the period on this topic. It's most of interest for covering the basic concept of the evolution of burial, cremation, and similar like funerary customs over time in response to stimuli within religion and within like the events that were happening around the time. You probably get no better idea of this than with the Black Death, and this is covered at some length within this work. Now, prior to the outbreak of the Black Death itself and sweeping across Europe, burials among Christian European cultures tended to be singular. A person was buried individually. There were no mass graves. The idea of a water burial would have been unacceptable. The idea of cremation would have been even more unacceptable. Typically speaking, people were paid to dispose of the body. Someone was paid to be an undertaker. At the time, you get the idea of the individual casket, whether crude or more elaborate. The idea of burying people with a token memento of the fact that they were of importance. All of these fall by the wayside during the plague, and you get instead people being dumped in mass graves. Now, you have some of these people who have already had the plague and are now immune, being hired at exorbitant fees to be undertakers. Some of these people became the next wave of nobility in the early Renaissance because they just sat there. They would charge 10 times the normal peasant's salary in order to bury bodies, and somebody would have to pay them. The church would pay them money to dispose of the dead. Some lord would pay them to dispose of the dead. The citizens, to the best of their ability, would pool money to dispose of the dead. Sometimes you had these very rugged, sort of uncouth people from far out there coming into the cities just to bury things. You have mass graves. You have the large-scale abandonment of the concept of the interpersonal blessing that a Catholic priest would normally give in favor of simply, at one point, I believe it was the Seine River was blessed in its totality so that bodies could be dumped in, and it would serve as sort of the general funeral blessing of Catholicism at the time. The Pope, of course, flees to his palace, surrounded by braziers of fire, and you get a topsy-turvy European culture at the time. It also speaks of Hindu burials, Islamic burials then in vogue at the time, the concept of the more elaborate sort of tombs and, engraved coffins and giving, jewelry to the dead, as well as the more simplistic side of burial, the idea of the open-air sort of unburial of Zoroastrianism, which is still practiced, where the dead would be taken to these sort of stone platforms, and the vultures would come down and pick the bodies apart, and this was considered acceptable. So you get a lot of cultures mentioned. For about 2,000 years of human history, you get the concept of embalming, of the immortelle, the concept of these little glass coffins that were filled usually with some sort of gas, actually, to keep the body from decaying. It was embalmed, put in there with a preservative gas. And some of these are still extant even to this day. I can't remember the exact name, but there's this one little girl in a glass coffin that's kind of famous and is basically perfectly preserved. Like, still looks like just sleeping, not even dead, and will probably remain that way for some centuries to come. You get all these weird customs. And as an work from the rational era, from the era of literal rationalism, the author takes sort of a skeptical approach to describing these customs, mostly saying, well, this is nonsense, that's nonsense, it's kind of weird that we do this stuff. What's kind of the purpose? It's just a corpse. If there's like a spirit, it has nothing to do with the actual dead body, and it would be laughable to the rational Christians of the era, it would be laughable that someone couldn't be resurrected if they were cremated or something like that. And points out that a lot of this doesn't even really come from Christendom. The burial practices straight from Judaism, which is also spoken of at length, or from even some of these pagan ideas that were had at the time. But it's an extremely interesting work. Very elaborate and complete look at some of these customs throughout time. If it had been written about half a century later, it probably would have had more to say about Egypt and Samaria. Nonetheless, though, as far as what was then known more historically, the Middle Ages up through the Renaissance. Very, very interesting indeed. Again, link in the description to my edition of this work on Amazon, second link to my books blog. If you're into the more literal side of the occult, there's plenty there too, as well for you. Whether you're more into trying to become immortal through alchemy or trying to hex people by raising demons, there's a little bit of everything there on the blog in different categories. That's about all. Peace out.